Belinda Royale lived in modern-day Ghana until she was kidnapped and sold into slavery as a child. She endured the Middle Passage as well as 50 years of enslavement. In 1783, Belinda Royale petitioned the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for her reparations from her master, Isaac Royale. Belinda had been stopped 15 pounds and 12 shillings and was to be paid out of Royale's estate. According to Ta-Nehisi Coates, an American author, journalist, and a national correspondent for The Atlantic, the reparations that were given to Belinda were one of the earliest successful attempts of reparations in American history. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in a letter from Birmingham jail that people in America have a moral responsibility to transform unjust laws and take action. These unjust laws range from housing discrimination to separate education. The insight offered by King and contemporary scholars draws up the question, should the United States government issue slavery reparations to African Americans? As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter, Black people have waited more than 340 years for their constitutional and God-given rights. Reparations would give African Americans an economic and political compensation for the historical wrongdoings the United States had committed with 340 years of slavery and more than 90 years of Jim Crow segregation. To understand the call for reparations, Americans had to understand the importance of compensating African Americans. The historic fight for equality advances the argument for reparations. Reparations are a critical aspect in fighting the presence of white supremacy that is still present in 21st century America, along with offering compensation and reconciliation for the consequences of slavery. On April 10th, Judge W.A. Jenkins issued an injunction against parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. and Southern Christian Leadership Conference activist Ralph Abernathy were arrested for the marches and sit-ins that were organized by the SCLC to protest the discrimination of African Americans. He wrote the letter from Birmingham jail in response to 8 white clergymen who wrote against his methods in the newspaper. King placed emphasis on all sorts of devious methods Alabama used to deny Black citizens to vote. Voting discrimination preserved Alabama's system of white supremacy. He addressed the measures required to transform the racial predicament in the South. King and many others sat in jail to shed light on the disadvantages white Americans inflicted on them. From having to drink from separate water fountains to being forbidden from buying a house, the racial plight that existed in the Civil Rights era is a requisite reason for reparations. Mortgage scams made it difficult for minorities to purchase homes, which set a precedent for America's racial wealth gap. 3 out of 4 neighborhoods that were redlined on government maps 81 years ago are still struggling economically. Redline areas were places that the Homeowners Loan Corporation marked as credit risk. These areas were more likely to be redlined because of the area's racial demographics. Bruce Mitchell, a senior researcher at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, explained that the houses inhabited by people who were not Northern European white were deemed as a detraction from the value of the area. Loans in this neighborhood were either unavailable or too expensive. According to Tracy Jan, a sociologist and political reporter who covers the intersection of race and economics, the Federal Housing Administration institutionalized the system in discriminatory lending. The residential segregation in housing was not banned until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Even after the 1960s, African Americans still endured the consequences of systematic oppression. In his letter, King described the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty amid an affluent society. What King mentioned in his letter speaks to African Americans like Clyde Ross, who were robbed of their chance to get a legitimate mortgage. Ross was a Black man fleeing warlords in the South during the Great Migration. He had attempted to acquire a mortgage in a neighborhood, but he was denied by the loan officer because there was no financing available, which was untrue. Since Clyde Ross was a black man, he was cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market. As Coates recounts, the white people in Chicago took every measure to ensure that neighborhoods remained segregated. While white people were able to accumulate wealth generation after generation due to inherited wealth and assets, African Americans were left to inherit little to nothing, continuing the road to poverty. The U.S. and other countries have issued reparations to targeted groups. Because other communities receive reparations, the same could happen for African Americans. In 1988, U.S. President Ronald Reagan apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The government had also paid $20,000 to over 800,000 victims of internment. While the United States was fighting against the Japanese, the U.S. took a hold of Kiska and Attu, islands in the Alaskan Aleutian chain. In Juneau, Alaska, about 2,000 miles from the islands, 881 Aleuts were deported to camps. The U.S. paid $12,000 to each of the 450 victims that were in the camps. In comparison, as of 2018, since 1952, Germany has paid $70 billion in reparations to the victims of the Holocaust. Germany agreed to pay over $88 million to fund the social welfare services for Holocaust survivors. Other countries are able to offer reconciliation and payment for the wrongdoings of their governments. Reparations for African Americans are realistic because the United States has provided reparations to other minorities. Gregory Kane, an American journalist and social commentator, affirms that forcing people to pay money to others based on their race and ethnicity would enhance the racial problems currently plaguing our society. Tom Shattuck, a columnist radio show host for Boston Herald, elaborates on Kane's claim by stating that it is not fair to make people pay for something that their ancestors took no part in. It will require $97 trillion to pay for the hours of uncompensated work done during the slavery era, and each slave descendant would have to receive $300,000. Camille Foster, the co-host of the column, builds onto Shattuck's claim by stating that Americans cannot mitigate several hundred years of past injustice through taking money from people in the 21st century. On the other hand, several politicians voiced their support for reparations as the 2020 presidential election approaches. Senator Kamala D. Harris considers how reparations would aid African Americans from under-resourced communities. She insists on taking an approach that would change policies and structures and make real investments in Black communities. Because of the government's refusal to let Black families acquire housing loans, they were not able to pass on real estate the way white families were able to. As a solution, Cory Booker, an American politician, believes the government should create baby bonds. These baby bonds would give every child $1,000 upon their birth, and through the tax code, they would receive $2,000 every year. This money would stay in a savings account until the child turned 18. The money would only be used for education, home ownership, and retirement purposes. Booker states that the majority of the money would go to minority children. The implications for implementing baby bonds is that it helps impoverished families and funds the education of thousands of kids. Derek Hamilton, executive director of Ohio State University's Curious Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, stated that Booker's plan would help Black families more than white families, but his solution is not race-based. The limitation to Booker's solution generalizes reparations and is more inclusive, which may not be seen as reconciliation to African Americans. Hamilton reiterates that Booker's solution is economically inclusive but not reparations. As another solution, 2020 presidential candidate Marianne Williamson suggests allocating $500 billion to redress a range of discriminatory policies. She builds upon her solutions by recommending the formation of a reparations council, which would handle everything regarding slavery reparations. As an implication, the $500 billion would transform areas that were adversely affected by redlining and fund educational programs. The most significant limitation would be determining who receives the money from reparations. It will be difficult delineating everyone's ancestry and if they were negatively impacted by chattel slavery and Jim Crow laws. Even with the council, there would be an issue determining who gets placed on the reparations council. Also, Williamson's solution would place a strain on the American economy. All of this has to be taken into consideration, but granting that compensations have been given to other communities and the disadvantages inflicted on African Americans with 340 years of slavery and 90 years of Jim Crow, the U.S. government should issue slavery reparations to African Americans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First question, Naisha. How did you select the strategies you used to gather information or conduct your research? Do you think they were effective?
I selected the strategies I used to conduct my research by focusing on the questions that were asked within the sources. For example, while I was watching Marianne Williamson's interview with Charlemagne the God, Charlemagne asked her where would the money for reparations come from? And she wasn't exactly able to answer the question, which was a limitation to that source. So I took it upon myself to research that myself, which contributed to which contributed greatly to how thorough my research was.
Okay, thanks. And second, what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these important?
Additional questions, I asked myself throughout my research exactly where reparations would come from, because a lot of my sources said the government would pay, but then other sources said that the American people would have to pay. That was really one of the main questions that I asked myself, because I could offer solutions, but with these solutions, I would have to figure out where the money would come from to fund all of the reparations that all of these politicians and scholars suggested in having.
Okay, thanks.